Think about those moments, where you're weighing different options, what to say, which path to take, and then suddenly, boom, one of those possibilities just becomes real. It's the reality now, and the others just fade. It feels so fundamental, this shift from what could be to what is. But what if that feeling isn't just subjective? What if it's actually tapping into something deeper, like a structure and how reality itself works?
That's a really interesting way to put it. Your intuition there, it actually touches on some pretty profound theoretical ideas we're exploring.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, today we're going to dive into a framework that honestly offers a pretty radical perspective.
Yeah.
The idea is that the present moment isn't passive. It acts as a kind of, well, a geometric nexus.
A geometric
A
nexus.
saddle point,
Yeah.
specifically.
Yeah.
And it's actively shaping how our past and future connect, especially in any system that, processes information.
Okay, geometric nexus, a saddle point sounds intriguing, but maybe a bit abstract for listeners just tuning in.
Sure. Let's break it down.
So for you listening, what we're going to try and do is explore this way of understanding how experiences become, fixed, how they become the past, and how possibilities arise for the future. And we'll be drawing from some really fascinating areas: geometry, especially curved spaces, how systems change over time, information theory, even computation.
Right. They all kind of converge here.
Yeah, and our goal isn't to drown everyone in jargon. It's more about revealing the maybe surprising implications of this. What do you call it? The geometric theory of the present.
That's the one.
Okay. So our mission today is pretty clear then. Get a handle on this core idea, the present as a saddle point, projecting a hyperbolic future onto a Euclidean past. Did I get that right?
You got it exactly right. And let's start right there with that core idea. The theory suggests that our past, everything that's happened, our accumulated memories and experiences, can be modeled as basically a flat space, Euclidean space.
Okay, flat, like a map.
Kind of, yeah. Imagine a smooth, unchanging surface. Each new event, each memory, it just gets added to what's already there. It accumulates. It doesn't fundamentally warp or erase the older stuff.
Right, like learning a new phone number doesn't wipe out your childhood memories. It just adds to the list.
Exactly, it's additive.
Yeah.
Mathematically, you can think of adding vectors in this flat space. A little change here doesn't have some huge, drastic effect way over there in the distant past. It's stable.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense for memory, yeah. It feels like a stable record, mostly.
Yeah.
So, if the past is flat and Euclidean, what's this hyperbolic future? Why hyperbolic? That sounds curvy.
It is, and that's the key difference. The future in this view is completely different. It's proposed to be negatively curved, hyperbolic.
Negatively curved.
Right.
What does that mean in terms of possibilities?
It means exponential growth. That's the crucial thing about hyperbolic space. Think about it. Start at one point. It branches into two options. Each of those branches into two more, and so on.
Okay, yeah, like a decision tree. Things explode outwards fast.
Precisely. The number of potential paths explodes exponentially. Hyperbolic geometry just is the geometry of that kind of growth. The volume, the space available within a certain distance from the starting point, grows exponentially, not linearly like in flat space.
Ah, I see. So it mirrors how choices seem to open up vastly more choices.
Exactly. Think about choosing a college major or a career path. That one choice suddenly opens up this huge landscape of further possibilities, subspecialties, job options, each branching further. These kinds of branching processes find a natural home mathematically in hyperbolic geometry.
Okay, that's a powerful image. A flat additive past and this exploding, branching, hyperbolic future. So where's the present? And why a saddle point? I'm picturing, a saddle on a horse.
Hey, yeah, the analogy holds surprisingly well. The present moment is seen as this critical interface, the meeting point between these two very different geometries. The past you came from, the future you're facing.
And now.
The now. And it's modeled as a saddle point. Think about a saddle shape. If you move along the horse's spine, it curves downwards like a minimum. But if you move across the saddle, side to side, it curves upwards like a maximum.
Right. Minimum one way, maximum the other.
Exactly. So, in our context, imagine your system, you, right now. You exist in your current state, your Euclidean past stretched out behind you, stable, determined. But you're facing this branching, hyperbolic future full of potential, unstable in a sense. The present is like that saddle point. From the perspective of the past, it's stable. From the perspective of the future, it's the point from which things diverge rapidly. It's also like a tiny, momentarily flat patch a tangent plane that touches both the past and the future right at your current state.
Okay, so it's this unique point connecting the two. And you said a choice gets made there. We pick one of those future branches.
Yes, that's where the action happens.
How does that choice then become part of the flat path? How does it link back?
That's the projection part.
There
It's
you go.
absolutely key. The act of choosing, which happens right there at the present, at the saddle point, it selects one specific direction. Think of it as picking one path, one tangent vector, out of all the possibilities offered by that hyperbolic future cone spreading out before you.
Okay, I pick a path.
And then that chosen path, that direction, gets projected, mathematically flattened, essentially onto the Euclidean past. It becomes the next tiny step, the delta math BFM we mentioned, the next bit of information added to your stable record.
Ah, okay. So let me try to stitch this together. The present is the saddle point. It looks at the branching hyperbolic future, picks one branch,
Right.
and then projects that choice down onto the flat Euclidean past, extending it by one little bit.
You've nailed it. The present collapses the hyperbolic potential, all those possibilities, onto the Euclidean record, the fixed past, through this saddle point projection. That moment of choice isn't just, deciding what to have for lunch. It's this fundamental geometric act of turning potential into actuality. A future branch becomes a new piece of the solid trunk of your experience.
Wow. Okay, that is a powerful way to frame it. It takes that intuitive feeling of the present being special and gives it this concrete geometric structure. Why is this perspective seen as so useful, though? What does it help explain that maybe other models don't?
Well, there are several really compelling aspects. First, it does this beautiful job of unifying dynamics, how things change over time with geometry, the underlying structure. It offers a geometric reason for the arrow of time.
Why the past feels fixed and the future open.
Exactly. It's rooted in this transition between curvatures, from slat and determined to negatively curved and branching. And it also gives a geometric basis for choice itself as this act of projection at the interface.
Okay, unifying dynamics and geometry. What else?
Second, it seems to provide a really natural way to integrate ideas from information theory, things we haven't really dug into yet, but concepts like Fisher information.
Which relates to how much information data gives you about a parameter.
Sort of, yeah. It describes the curvature of statistical models, or you could think of it as the curvature of our internal beliefs or models of the world, and also the free energy principle, which is about systems trying to minimize surprise or prediction error.
How they fit in.
Well, the idea is that the choice made at the saddle point, the projection, isn't random, it's guided. And maybe it's guided by minimizing free energy, or maybe the shape of our internal beliefs, described by Fisher information, influences which future path gets selected and projected. These become potential mechanisms operating at that critical present moment.
So information theory concepts could describe the how of the choice at the saddle point.
Precisely. And thirdly, just to reiterate, the geometries themselves explain the difference between recording and branching. Euclidean geometry naturally handles additive recording. Hyperbolic geometry naturally handles exponential branching. The present is the transformation point.
Makes sense. You also mentioned AI.
Yeah, that's a really exciting potential application. Imagine building computational systems, maybe neural networks, that explicitly use this structure, like having a Euclidean layer for stable memory storage and a hyperbolic layer for exploring possibilities or making decisions, connected by some kind of learned projection operator that acts like the saddle point choice. It's a totally different architectural approach.
A hybrid geometry AI.
Could be. And finally, on a more maybe philosophical level, it feels metaphysically resonant. It offers a rigorous way to talk about how definite structure emerges from potentiality, how time flows through these moments of decision. It aligns with intuition, but gives it mathematical teeth,
Yeah, definitely. It feels like it connects a few dots. Okay, you mentioned the math. Can we revisit that just a bit? Without getting lost in equations, what are the core mathematical ideas again?
Sure. So the past.
Euclidean manifold. Key property. Zero curvature. Flat. Easy enough.
Got it. Flat past.
The future. Hyperbolic manifold. Key property. Negative curvature. Usually constant negative curvature, K0. This negative curvature in 1K ERA is what drives the exponential volume growth, the branching.
Okay, negative curvature, branching future.
Now the present. At that specific moment, at your current state, you can think about the immediate directions you could move in the past and the immediate directions available in the future. These are the tangent spaces.
Yeah.
TF for MT, math KFM.
Like the flat approximations right at that point. Exactly. Little flat patches touching the manifolds there. And the choice operator, let's call it, it essentially lives in this present moment interface. It takes input maybe from the environment, maybe your internal state, and it selects a direction vector from the future's tangent space
Uh-huh.
and maps it, projects it onto the past's tangent space as the next step, the change, DMath BFM.
Okay. And the saddle point.
Yeah.
How does that show up mathematically beyond the visual analogy?
You can think about it in terms of curvature itself changing. Imagine a parameter that sort of moves you from past through the present into the future. The scalar curvature would transition from 0 in the past through some complex behavior at the present to being negative in the future. The present is where this fundamental change in geometric character happens.
A transition zone in curvature.
Right. Or think about a potential energy landscape. The present acts like a saddle point in this landscape. If you move backwards in time towards the past, you're going down a stable valley. If you move forwards towards the future, you're at a ridge point where paths diverge rapidly downhill into different valleys.
Stable directions and unstable directions meeting right there.
Exactly. Mathematically, you could look at the Hessian matrix, the matrix of second derivatives of this potential at the saddle point. It would have eigenvalues corresponding to these stable, past, and unstable future directions. The act of choice is navigating this saddle, collapsing the potential future trajectories onto one specific extension of the past trajectory.
That landscape analogy really helps clarify the stability and stability aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other deeper connections? You mentioned Jacobi fields earlier.
Yeah, that's another interesting angle. Jacobi fields basically measure how initially parallel paths spread apart or converge on a curved manifold. In hyperbolic space, they diverge exponentially.
Reflecting the branching possibilities again.
Right, so you could think of the present as the point where all these potential future paths, represented by diverging Jacobi fields, are still infinitesimally close together, still within reach to be chosen before they spread out uncontrollably into the hyperbolic future.
Before the exponential divergence really kicks in.
Exactly. And the Fisher geometry link we touched on, the idea is that the projection, the choice, isn't arbitrary. It's conditioned by your internal state, your beliefs, your knowledge. Fission information provides a way to measure the curvature or geometry of that internal belief space.
So it's like an interface between the external hyperbolic curvature of possibilities and the internal belief curvature.
That's a great way to think about it. The saddle point mediates between external potential and internal state. And then there's the thermodynamic angle via the free energy principle. Selecting a path at the saddle point could be viewed as an optimization process. The system chooses the path that minimizes expected surprise or, equivalently, maximizes the evidence for its internal model of the world. It's an information theoretic take on optimal decision-making under uncertainty, happening right at that geometric interface.
Wow, okay. There are layers upon layers here, connecting geometry, information, dynamics. It's a lot to absorb, but really fascinating. To just kind of ground ourselves again, we quickly summarize the main players in this theory, like a quick reference.
Good idea. Let's do a quick table on our minds.
Yeah.
Past, geometry is Euclidean. Flat, dynamics, additive recording, accumulation. Future, geometry is hyperbolic, negatively curved. Dynamics, exponential branching, diverging possibilities.
Okay, past flat, future curved.
Present, the interface. Geometrically, a saddle point in the curvature landscape. It's the tangent plane where choice happens. Choice. The selection of a future tangent vector, a possibility. Integration. The projection of that chosen vector onto the Euclidean past, extending the record.
Projection makes it real, adds it to the past.
Exactly. And maybe biological instantiations. We could speculate about processes in the brain, maybe involving neural gradients or decision thresholds that might physically embody this transition from exploring potential, hyperbolic-like,
Right.
to committing to an action or memory, Euclidean-like.
Interesting. Still speculative there, but interesting. Okay, so let's bring it back home. That initial thought experiment, the feeling of choosing, of potential becoming actual. What does this whole geometric framework ultimately tell us about that very human experience?
Well, I think it suggests that our feeling, our intuition about the present being this pivotal moment, this cusp, it's not just a psychological quirk. It might actually reflect a fundamental geometric structure of reality, or at least of how information processing systems interact with reality.
So the feeling matches the proposed physics in a way.
In a way, yes. The present is where the determined flat landscape of what has been meets the vast curved branching landscape of what could be. And the act of choosing, of deciding, is the mechanism. It's the projection process that takes one of those infinite possibilities and makes it part of the concrete, recorded past.
It gives decision-making a kind of cosmic significance almost.
You could say that. It suggests that the simple act of making choice has these incredibly deep roots in the underlying geometry of how potential unfolds into actuality.
This has definitely given me a completely new lens to view something I experience constantly but never really thought about structurally. Yeah.
And if our choices in the present are the very saddle points where we select and collapse that potential into our single Euclidean reality,
Yeah.
what does that truly imply about the weight, the significance of each present moment, each decision?
It makes them feel heavier somehow.
Maybe. Or maybe understanding this underlying curvature of potential, understanding the nature of this saddle point we're constantly navigating. Maybe that awareness itself could help us approach uncertainty, approach our choices with, I don't know, a bit more clarity or purpose.
A very powerful thought indeed. Something to definitely mull over. So let's dive into this division, but maybe from an angle you weren't expecting. Strictly biological.
Ah, okay. Not philosophy, then.
Not directly. We've been looking at some really interesting biological frameworks recently. And while consciousness is the word that often pops up, we're going to deliberately sidestep that and look at the nuts and bolts, the biological machinery defining this boundary.
Right. So if we're not centering on consciousness, what's the biological starting point for understanding this now?
The core concept, really, is seeing a living thing as an active biological system under selective pressure. That perspective lets us define the past, the future, and crucially, the present in, well, tangible biological ways.
Okay, an active biological system. I like that. So biologically speaking, what is the past? It's got to be more than just memory, right?
Oh, definitely. Biologically, the past is kind of like a discrete record. Think blockchain, maybe, where each block builds on the last one. It's recorded history.
Okay, a biological blockchain. What makes up the blocks?
Well, first up, you've got the genome, your DNA sequence. That's the foundational history, the sort of hard-coded results of millions of years of evolutionary choices. The core protocol, if you will.
Right, the blueprint inherited over generations. Got it. What else is in this record?
On top of that, there's the epigenome. These are modifications to the DNA, think methylation, things like that, that change how genes get read.
Mm-hmm.
And these changes often happen because of past interactions with the environment. So they're like metadata tags or state updates on the genome. Still discrete, still history, but reflecting individual past experiences, like how diet or stress can leave marks.
So genome is deep history. Epigenome is like recent annotations based on life experience. What about the organism's state right now?
That's the cellular state. This is the current snapshot. Discrete, again, specific protein levels, membrane potentials, metabolite concentrations. It's incredibly complex, sure, but it's a definite arrangement of molecules and conditions at a point in time. The current block, maybe, in our analogy. It sums up the immediate result of all past actions.
Okay, past equals layered discrete record. Genome, epigenome, cellular state, makes sense. Now what about the future? That feels fuzzier, less defined.
Exactly right. Biologically, the future is best seen as continuous potential, a realm of possibilities. Two main parts to this.
Okay.
First, there's the environment, everything outside the organism. Temperature, nutrients, other creatures, light, chemical signals. It's this vast, constantly shifting field of factors, a continuous spectrum of potential inputs and pressures.
And the second part of this continuous future?
The second is internal randomness, stochasticity. Even inside a cell, things aren't perfectly predictable. Molecules jiggle randomly because of heat, right? Thermal noise, maybe even some quantum effects and reactions. This inherent fuzziness, this internal jostling, adds another layer of continuous possibility, uncertainty.
Okay, so the past is this fixed, layered, discrete thing. The future is this wide open, continuous space of possibilities, environment, plus randomness. Which brings us to the main event.
Yeah.
The present. How does this active biological system sit between them?
Right. The present isn't just a passive line on a timeline. It's where the action happens. It's the biological system actively processing information, making decisions based on environmental input and its current state, that cellular state we talked about.
So it's an engine, not just a marker.
Exactly. An information processing engine. It doesn't just record the past. It actively shapes the next moment. It's where the continuous future starts getting carved up into the discrete past.
Okay, how does that carving happen? How does continuous potential get turned into discrete events? What are the biological processes doing that work?
Several key things are going on. Take sensing and signal transduction. A cell might bump into a smooth gradient of some chemical in the water, right? Continuous input.
Uh-huh.
But when its receptors bind that chemical, it kicks off a chain reaction inside. Specific proteins get activated. Maybe second messengers are made. These are discrete molecular events.
Wow.
A sequence of steps. So continuous outside signal becomes discrete inside signal. That's the first cut.
Interesting, like translating analog to digital almost. What's next?
Then you often get gene regulation. Those internal signals can cause, say, a transcription factor protein to bind to a very specific discrete spot on the DNA, on the genome.
Right.
And that binding leads to a discrete choice. This gene gets turned on or it stays off, make this protein or don't. Another discrete decision based on the signal cascade.
So the present is constantly choosing which bits of the past the genes to activate.
In a way, yes. And you see something similar with metabolic flux. Enzymes channel molecules through specific discrete pathways. Which pathway gets used depends on the cell's needs, available materials, and signals continuous availability meets discrete channeling. Choices, again.
And for us multicellular folks, how does behavior fit in?
Good point. In multicellular organisms, especially with nervous systems, you have behavioral response. Think about neural networks. They take in continuous sensory data light, sound, touch. They compare it against stored patterns, which are basically the strengths of connections between neurons, a kind of discrete record of past learning.
Okay.
And then they trigger discrete outputs. A muscle contracts, a sound is made, a specific action, again, integrating the continuous, checking the past, making a discrete move.
Wow. So from molecules right up to behavior, it seems like the present is just this constant series of discrete selections, responding to continuous possibilities filtered through the organism's history.
That's the picture. And crucially, this is where selective pressure hits. In the present, the consequences of those choices, did the bacterium find food and divide? Did the animal dodge the predator? Those outcomes determine survival, reproduction. They decide which past records, which genomes actually get copied into the future.
Okay, let me try and sum that up. The present isn't some abstract point. It's this, like, incredibly busy information processing interface. It's where our history, that discrete past, meets the continuous potential of the future and makes irreversible choices. It's biological computation, sorting what works from what doesn't, constantly fighting entropy to maintain order.
Exactly. All this talk about discrete states, continuous potentials, selection. It's funny, it really takes me back. My undergrad work was in biology at MIT, and this is exactly the kind of stuff, the fundamental questions we used to wrestle with. It feels right. It clicks.
Finally, your turf.
Checkles. Okay, enough reminiscing. But yeah, it provides a solid foundation. Let's try and put more formal structure on this biological philosophy.
Absolutely. Let's get formal. Lay out the framework.
Right. So let's maybe call it the information thermodynamic interface. Life in the middle. Sounds grand, but it helps organize the ideas.
I like it. Life in the middle.
So you have the domains, the past. That's our discrete record, embodied by the genome, the epigenome, and the current cellular state. All history.
Okay. Past equals discrete record.
Then the future. That's the continuous potential. Primarily the external environment, but also including that internal thermodynamic noise, the random molecular jiggling, adding unpredictability.
Continuous potential. Got it.
And smack in the middle, the present.
Yeah.
This is the computational collapse, performed by the active biological system. It's where potential becomes actual.
Computational collapse, that really captures possibilities narrowing down to one reality.
Oh, yeah. And we could even try to write a sort of biological state transition equation.
Yeah.
If the system stayed at time, then the state a moment later, st plus delta t, is some function, let's call it, of the current state, the environment, the genome, and the epigenome. So like st plus delta t, math-cal. It shows how the present state evolves based on history and current conditions.
Okay, a bit abstract, but I see the components. State depends on prior state, environment, and the historical records.
Exactly. Now, thinking about that interface again, where continuous meets discrete, we can introduce something called the core differential. Two ways to look at it.
All right.
First, frac dst. This sort of represents how changes in the continuous environment drive changes in the discrete biological state. Think of the cell responding to its world.
Environment changing the cell.
The other way is frac det. This is more like us, as scientists, looking at changes in the cell state and trying to infer what happened in the environment. It's the inference perspective.
Ah, okay. Cell reacting versus us observing and inferring. Two sides of the same coin.
Precisely. Which leads us nicely to this idea of selective computation as temporal collapse. Let's imagine a kind of operator, a selective processor, math, text, bio.
Okay.
It takes the history, genome, epigenome, and the current environment as inputs. And what it outputs is a specific, discrete change in state, delta S.
So inputs are history and environment. Output is the specific change that happens now.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The system faces many possibilities based on MathCom.
Oh.
Driven by the need to survive and operate within thermodynamic constraints, collapses that potential into one single outcome, delta S. It's like a biological wave function collapse, maybe.
Yeah.
Triggered by the imperative to persist.
Wow. Okay. So the genome and epigenome set the rules, the environment presents the options, and this selective processor makes the choice, the collapse, resulting in a definite biological event.
You got it. Okay, the final statement? Maybe. The thing defining the present biologically is the biological selection function operating under entropy pressure.
Okay. I'll unpack that a bit.
It's an adaptive, stateful, low-entropy compression engine. What does it do? It irreversibly collapses possibility into action. It's fundamentally about selective biological computation constrained by thermodynamics. That's the what to the present moment.
Adaptive, stateful, low-entropy compression engine collapsing possibility into action via selective computation. That's dense but precise.
We could even phrase it as a principle, the biological principle of selective collapse. Life happens right at the boundary, where structured memory, the past, meets uncertain flux, the future. And at every instant, it chooses one irreversible path out of all that could be's, using everything that ever was.
Which leads to a pretty big question for you, the listener. If you think about the present this way, as this constant biological selection engine, how does that change how you view your own decisions? Or learning? Or even just being? Does your subjective feeling of now match up with this idea of relentless biological computation?
And maybe even, does this imply that even when you feel passive, your biology is still making countless microscopic choices that steer your future? It's definitely food for thought.
Absolutely. Hey, you've joined us for another dive into something that really makes you go, huh. Today, we're looking at this idea, this paradox almost. Our senses are just soaking up this crazy amount of information constantly. I mean, think of everything you're seeing and hearing right now.
Totally. It's overwhelming if you stop to consider it.
But then our actual thinking speed, what we consciously process, what we act on, it seems, well, surprisingly slow.
Yeah, chill is a good word for it. It's like our brains are sipping from Niagara Falls with a tiny, tiny straw.
A straw. I like that.
You know, our eyes alone, they can pull in data at something like a billion bits a second, a gigabit. It's wild.
A gigabit per second, just the eyes.
Just the eyes. But what we actually do with that, the decisions we make, the thoughts we form, it comes way, way down, more like 10 bits per second.
10? That's the number we're digging into today, right?
That's the magic number.
Yeah.
Or maybe the frustratingly slow number, depending on how you look at it.
Right. And to help us get our heads around this huge gap, you brought along some research.
I did. It's a paper called The Unbearable Slowness of Being. Why Do We Live at 10 Bits? By Jiu Zhang and Marcus Meister.
Okay.
And they really try to tackle this, this speed limit. They look at all sorts of things, games, tasks, brain wiring.
Cool. So for everyone listening, especially if you're trying to learn things efficiently, our mission today is kind of figure out this bottleneck. Why just 10 bits?
Exactly. What does it tell us about how our brains are set up? Maybe it even challenges how we think about our own mental quickness, you know?
Yeah, maybe we're not as fast as we feel sometimes. Ready to unravel this?
Let's do it.
Okay, 10 bits per second. It still feels kind of low, doesn't it? Almost insulting.
It does feel counterintuitive.
But this paper, it starts with some really neat, relatable examples. The one that really grabbed me was the 20 questions game.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic illustration.
Right. Explain how that works in terms of bits.
Okay, so you think of an object, right? And I ask yes-no questions. Each really good question I ask, one that splits the remaining possibilities roughly in half. That gives me about 1 bit of information. It halves the uncertainty.
Okay.
The fact that we can usually guess the object within, say, 20 questions means the person thinking of the object must be navigating a space of maybe 1 million possibilities.
Yeah.
That's 2 to the power of 20, roughly.
Oh, okay.
And if you work out the timing, how quickly they answer, it lands you right back in that ballpark, around 10 bits per second of accessing and communicating that information.
So even a simple game points to this speed limit.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It suggests the rate at which we access and use info fits this Yeah, surprisingly slow pace.
Mind-blowing. And it's not just games, right? This 10 bits thing pops up everywhere in the research.
It really does. Take typing, for instance.
Okay, yeah. Someone typing fast, like 120 words a minute, that feels quick.
It feels quick. But language, especially English, is really predictable. Redundant, you could say. Certain letters, certain words are much more likely to follow others. So the amount of new, unpredictable information being generated by the typist isn't just about finger speed. When you factor in that redundancy, it drops way down.
Yeah.
Around 10 bits per second again.
Yeah.
If you made someone type random letters, total gibberish, their speed in bits per second would probably be higher, but their words per minute would plummet.
Right, because every letter would be a surprise. So it's about the choices being made, the information content.
Exactly.
And listening, like understanding speech.
Similar deal. People tend to speak clearly for comprehension, around maybe 160 words a minute. If you calculate the information rate there, it bumps up a little, maybe 13 bits per second.
Still pretty close, though.
Still in that same neighborhood, yeah. Language seems to operate within this channel capacity.
Okay, language has its pace. But what about something nonverbal, purely visual, maybe, like Rubik's Cubes? You mentioned blindfolded speed cubing.
Yeah, that one's fascinating because they split the task. First, they look at the scrambled cube, memorize it.
Yep.
Then, blindfolded, they solve it.
How long do they look?
The record for just looking at the perception phase is incredibly short. Like 5.5 seconds for a cube with, well, billions upon billions of possible scrambles.
Whoa.
And if you calculate the information needed to specify that scramble state, it works out to about 11.8 bits per second during that brief viewing time.
Still right around 10. That's uncanny.
And get this, that memorization time is often pretty close to the time they spend physically manipulating the cube blindfolded.
So intake and output speeds are kind of matched?
It seems that way, yeah. Like our ability to perceive the problem and our ability to execute the solution run at a similar information rate.
That's a really neat link. What about tasks that are purely about memory, like those memory championships?
Good question. They looked at that too. Take an event like 5-minute binary, memorizing strings of random zeros and ones.
Sounds intense.
It is. The world record holders managed to memorize at a rate of about 5 bits per second during those 5 minutes.
A bit lower, but still close.
And then there's speed cards, memorizing a shuffle deck. That's faster, closer to 18 bits per second for the very best.
So some variation, but...
But look at the range. 5 bits, 11.8 bits, 18 bits. They're all within a pretty small factor of that central 10 bits per second figure. Despite these tasks being really different, visual inspection, language, pure memory encoding this bottleneck seems pretty consistent.
It really hammers home that there might be some fundamental limit on our conscious processing. The paper mentions other things too, right? Like video games.
Yep, briefly. Things like choice reaction time experiments, recognizing objects, reading speed, even elite esports players in games like StarCraft or Tetris. Same story. Their peak action rates, when you analyze the information content, tend to hover around that 10, maybe up to 20 bits per second range.
It's almost spooky how consistent it is.
It really is. Especially when you contrast it with, the technology around us. Your Wi-Fi speed is probably hundreds of megabits per second.
Right. Thousands, maybe millions of times faster than this 10 bits we're talking about.
Yeah. Exactly. We feel like we perceive this rich, detailed world, but what we can consciously grab onto and act upon seems to trickle through this tiny cognitive pipe.
Okay, so we've established we're kind of slow, cognitively speaking.
Yeah.
But our brains.
Yeah.
Billions of neurons, right? Firing like crazy. Feels like the machinery should handle way more.
That's the other side of the paradox, isn't it? The input side.
Yeah. How much are our senses actually taking in? How do we even measure that?
So scientists use something called information theory. It's basically a mathematical way to quantify uncertainty or surprise in a signal.
Okay.
You can think of neurons as communication channels. For sensory systems like the eye, we can often control the input, the light patterns, and measure how the neurons respond. By looking at the range of responses and how reliably they signal changes in the input, we can calculate the information rate.
And what happens when you apply that to, say, the photoreceptors in our eyes, the cones and rods?
The numbers become astronomical. A single cone cell, one tiny light detector in your retina, can transmit information at something like 270 bits per second under the right conditions.
270 for one cell.
Yep, and you have about 6 million cones in each eye, plus all the rods.
So the total input.
You add it all up, the raw sensory information hitting both retinas is estimated to be around 1.6 gigabits per second.
Okay, wait. 1.6 billion bits per second coming in, and we're consciously processing maybe 10 bits per second.
See, Niagara Falls in a straw.
That's insane. The paper calls the ratio between input and output the sifting number, right?
Yeah.
Something huge.
Yeah, about 10 to the power of 8. So like
Yeah.
100 million to 1. An enormous amount of filtering is happening.
Where does that filtering start? Is it all deep in the brain?
A lot of it starts very early. Even the optic nerve, the cable carrying signals from the eye to the brain, has a much lower capacity than the photoreceptors themselves, maybe 100 megabits per second. Still huge, but already a big reduction.
So the retina itself is doing a ton of pre-processing, compressing the data.
Exactly. It's pulling out the important features, edges, contrasts, motion, discarding a lot of the raw data even before it leaves the eye.
Okay, so massive filtering happens early, but the paper also made a point about individual neurons within the brain, right? That they aren't necessarily slow either.
That's another key piece.
Huh.
A single neuron communicates using electrical spikes. Each spike can convey maybe a couple of bits of information depending on its timing and pattern,
Okay.
and neurons can fire hundreds of times per second when they're active. So potentially, a single active neuron could be transmitting hundreds of bits per second.
Way more than our overall 10 bits behavioral output.
Right. So the limitation doesn't seem to be the speed of the individual components.
Yeah.
The neurons themselves, they seem capable of much higher rates.
Okay. This mismatch is just wild. Gigabits in, fast neurons inside, but only 10 bits out in terms of what we consciously do. There must be reasons people push back against this slowness idea. Common objections.
Definitely. People often bring up things that feel much faster.
Like photographic memory, eidetic imagery.
Exactly. That idea that some people can just glance at something and remember it perfectly, every detail.
Does that hold up?
Well, the actual scientific evidence for true, perfect photographic memory is surprisingly weak. It's mostly anecdotal. If it were real and common, you'd expect people with it to completely dominate memory competitions. But as we saw, even the world champions in tasks like memorizing binary digits or cards.
They're still in that 10 bits range.
Pretty much, yeah. These incredible techniques in practice, but they don't seem to be bypassing this fundamental processing limit. So the lack of strong evidence for photographic memory kind of reinforces the idea of this bottleneck.
The paper mentioned a couple of specific cases, though, that stereogram study.
Right, the fused stereogram study where someone supposedly integrated images seen days apart. It's intriguing, but hard to replicate and had some methodological questions. It's not really solid proof against the 10 bits limit.
And the artist, the one who draws cityscapes from memory.
Oh, Stephen Wiltshire. His work is amazing, truly remarkable. He takes a brief helicopter ride and then draws these incredibly detailed panoramic views.
It feels like photographic memory.
It does, but the paper makes a good point. Even if his drawings were perfectly accurate down to the window pane, and they're often not that precise, more capturing the essence, the rate at which he acquired the necessary information during that short flight, if you estimate the complexity, it probably still falls well within that, say, single-digit bits per second range while he was looking. It's an incredible skill, but maybe not evidence of bypassing the speed limit during perception.
So our feeling of having this perfect instant recall is likely an illusion. What about just looking around, the richness of vision? It feels so detailed everywhere I look.
That's another powerful illusion. Psychologists call it subjective inflation.
Okay.
Our brains do a fantastic job of making us feel like our entire visual field is sharp, clear, and in focus. But it's not true. Yet, the really high-resolution part of your vision, the fovea, covers a tiny area, like the size of your thumbnail held at arm's length. Everything else, your peripheral vision, is much blurrier, less detailed, worse at color. But because we can flick our eyes around so rapidly, saccading from point to point 3 or 4 times a second, our brain stitches it together into this seamless high-res feeling.
So it's filling in the gaps.
Exactly. You can test it right now. Stare at one word on this screen, and without moving your eyes, try to read words way off to the side.
Whoa. Yeah, you're right. It's much harder than I thought. It gets blurry fast.
See, and this relates to things like inattentional blindness, too.
Where you miss something obvious, like the gorilla walking through the basketball game.
Precisely. If your attention, your limited processing bandwidth, is focused elsewhere, you can be functionally blind to things right in front of you.
Wow.
It all points to conscious awareness being far less comprehensive than our subjective experience suggests.
Okay, so conscious processing seems limited, but what about all the learning and adapting our brain does unconsciously? Doesn't that require processing vast amounts of information over time? The paper mentioned learning statistics of the world.
It's a really interesting angle. Our
Yeah.
brains are amazing statistical learners, picking up on patterns in our environment without conscious effort.
Right. Surely that takes a lot of bits.
You'd think so. But the paper brings up a fascinating example. Those classic experiments where kittens were raised seeing only vertical stripes.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about those. Their brains actually changed, right? They couldn't see horizontal lines properly.
Exactly. Their visual cortex adapted to the limited input. But here's the kicker. When researchers tried to estimate how much new information the kitten's brain actually gained by learning this vertical world rule,
How much?
it was estimated to be only around 2 bits.
2. That seems ridiculously low for such a fundamental change.
It does. The argument is that much of the statistical structure of the visual world has this property called translation invariance. Basically, the same rules apply everywhere. Think of textures like wood grain or grass. Once your brain figures out the local pattern, it doesn't need to relearn it for every single patch of grass. It can apply the same processing across the visual field.
Ah, like a copy-paste for neural processing?
Kind of. It's incredibly efficient. It means the brain doesn't need to store unique information for every single location. It learns general rules and applies them widely. So even significant adaptation might correspond to a surprisingly small amount of stored information.
So our brains are smart filterers and pattern matchers, not just massive data recorders.
That seems to be a big part of the story, yeah. It's about efficiency and extracting what matters.
Okay, this 10 bits limit seems pretty robust. What are the broader implications? The paper touches on memory storage, evolution, even brain-computer interfaces. Let's start with memory capacity.
This comparison is wild. If you estimate the brain's potential storage capacity based on the number of synapses, the connections between neurons, you get these enormous numbers, like 50 terabytes, maybe more.
50 terabytes, that's huge.
It is.
Yeah.
But then compare that to how much information might actually get in over a lifetime.
Okay.
Let's be generous. Maybe our genes give us a starting point estimate that around, say, 0.8 gigabytes, like the human genome size.
Right.
Then add 100 years of experience, learning, perceiving, all happening at that bottleneck rate of 10 bits per second.
How much does that add up to?
Over a century. Only about 4 gigabytes.
Wait, 50 terabytes of potential storage, but only maybe 5 gigabytes total input from genes and lifetime experience.
See the mismatch? It's vast. It suggests either our brain storage is incredibly redundant and perhaps inefficient.
Like lots of backup copies?
Maybe. Or that we use that vast synaptic network for computation and flexibility, not just for storing unique bits of information. It really makes you question what memory capacity even means in a biological system we clearly don't fill up.
Fascinating. What about other animals? Is life lived at 10 bits for everyone?
That's a great question, and surprisingly, we don't have a lot of comparative data on this cognitive throughput across species. Yeah. The paper speculates that for creatures in slow-changing environments, maybe a slow rate is fine. But what about birds navigating complex forests, or insects performing rapid aerial maneuvers?
You'd think they'd need to be faster.
Intuitively, yes. But the actual measurements are sparse. There was one study mentioned on fly behavior, their corrective torque response to visual changes. It was calculated at only 0.62 bits per second.
Even slower than us.
Way slower. Now, that's just one specific reflex, not their whole cognitive process, but it shows that high neural speed doesn't automatically translate to high behavioral information rates, even in insects. Maybe there are trade-offs with energy cost or complexity.
It does make you think about machines, though. Computers and AI can process information so much faster. The StarCraft example.
Right, where AI bots playing against top humans actually have their actions per minute artificially capped to match human limits.
Because otherwise they'd just be impossibly fast.
Exactly. It highlights that our biological system has this inherent speed limit that technology doesn't share. Our world, our infrastructure, our rules, they're often implicitly designed around this human pace.
Which brings us to this musk illusion idea the paper mentions, this feeling many of us have, that our inner mental life is way richer and faster than 10 bits.
That sense that our thoughts are racing, complex, nuanced, and our clumsy words or typing just can't keep up.
Yeah, I feel that sometimes.
Me too. The paper suggests this feeling might be more about the potential range of thoughts we could have in the next moment, rather than the actual speed at which we process one specific thought stream.
Ah, so it's the awareness of possibilities, not simultaneous processing.
That's the idea. Because we could think about 1,000 different things. It feels vast and fast, even if we're actually processing them more sequentially at that limited rate. It's subjective inflation again, perhaps.
And this belief fuels the dream of high-bandwidth brain-computer interfaces, right? Like Neuralink, just pipe the thoughts straight out.
Precisely. Bypass the slow physical output speech, hands, and get direct mind-to-machine communication at the speed of thought.
But if this 10 bits limit is real and cognitive,
Then even with a perfect connection directly to the brain, the paper predicts the actual information rate you could meaningfully extract or communicate would still be limited.
around 10 bits per second.
Likely in that same ballpark, yeah. Comparable to language. You might get slightly faster selection of predefined options, maybe, but generating truly novel, complex thought streams. Probably still capped by that cognitive bottleneck.
That's a pretty sobering prediction for some of those BCI visions.
It suggests the bottleneck isn't just the output muscles, it's deeper in the cognitive processing itself.
And this has implications for therapeutic BCIs, too, helping people with paralysis or sensory loss.
Absolutely. Think about retinal implants for blindness. Early ideas were often about trying to pump high-res video data onto the retina or visual cortex.
Trying to match the gigabit input.
Kind of, yeah. But it generally hasn't worked well. The brain seems overwhelmed or unable to interpret that fire hose of raw data.
So what works better?
Approaches that do more pre-processing. Instead of raw video, maybe the system identifies key objects or dangers and conveys that semantic information at a much lower bandwidth, like having a system whisper person approaching or obstacle ahead.
Using that 10 bits channel effectively.
Exactly. Focusing on conveying the essential processed information that the user can actually interpret and act upon. Similarly, for motor BCIs, decoding complex high-speed movements is incredibly hard. Sometimes simpler interfaces, like controlling a cursor or using a speech synthesizer activated by neural signals, might be more practical and effective for many patients because they work within that realistic bandwidth.
Understanding the limits helps design better tools. Okay, so we accept the 10 bits. Why? What's causing this bottleneck? The paper explores a few possibilities. First, maybe our neurons are just bad hardware. Noisy, inefficient.
That's one hypothesis you could have. Biological components aren't perfect like silicon transistors. Maybe we need massive redundancy just to get reliable computation.
But the paper argues against that being the main reason.
It does. As we mentioned, single neurons can actually be remarkably precise in their timing and response. Think about the auditory system distinguishing tiny time differences.
Right.
And while there's some redundancy, the idea that the brain is just millions of identical neurons doing the same simple thing doesn't really fit with what we know about specialized brain areas and complex circuits, even in relatively simpler brains like a fruit fly's. The hardware seems pretty sophisticated, actually.
Okay, so probably not just crappy neurons. What about serial versus parallel processing? This seems key.
I think this is a really central point. Our sensory systems are massively parallel,
Yeah.
right? Millions of receptors working at once. Early brain processing, also highly parallel.
But then
you hit conscious awareness, decision-making, goal-directed behavior, and it often feels strikingly serial, one thing at a time.
like the cocktail party effect, you can hear multiple conversations, but you can usually only attend to one.
Exactly. Or the psychological refractory period. If you have to respond to two signals quickly, one after the other, your response to the second one is delayed, as if the first one is still occupying some central processor.
We can't truly multitask complex thoughts.
It seems very difficult, if not impossible, for tasks demanding central attention. Even expert chess players seem to analyze potential move sequences serially, not explore multiple branches fully in parallel. Why? Why this convergence from massively parallel input to a seemingly single-threaded conscious process? That's a huge question.
It really is. Could our evolutionary history play a role? The paper had a cool idea about movement.
Yeah, I love this perspective. The argument goes, what was the original purpose of brains? Likely to control movement.
Makes sense. Find food, avoid danger.
Right. Early nervous systems probably evolved for things like navigation. An organism is in one place, needs to decide which way to move next. It's inherently a serial decision process tied to a single body moving through space.
So the architecture was built for one action at a time.
Plausibly, yes. And then, much later, abstract thought, language, complex reasoning, these might have essentially co-opted that existing, fundamentally serial architecture.
Piggybacking on the movement control system.
Sort of. We might be running our fancy cognitive software on hardware originally designed for guiding a body. The use of memory palaces by memory athletes, associating abstract items with locations along a familiar route, could be seen as evidence of fitting abstract tasks onto a spatial navigation framework.
Fitting square pegs of thought into round holes of spatial processing. Kinda.
Maybe. It suggests the limitation might be deeply rooted in our evolutionary past.
But psychology also talks about bottlenecks, right? Like an attentional bottleneck.
Yes, those are useful descriptive models. They capture the phenomenon, lots of info comes in, gets filtered, and only a limited amount gets through for deeper processing or conscious awareness. We experience this filtering.
But do we know what is the limiting resource? Is it a specific brain area, a chemical?
That's the mystery. The paper points out that despite these psychological metaphors, bottleneck, single channel, we haven't clearly identified the specific neural resource that's maxed out. When neuroscientists build computational models for tasks like decision-making or image recognition, the number of simulated neurons needed isn't usually astronomical. We have billions of neurons in our cortex. Why can't we run, say, 10 of these decision-making processes in parallel if the hardware seems sufficient?
We have the computing power, theoretically, but can't seem to use it all at once for conscious tasks.
Exactly. It's not obviously a lack of processing units, which leads to this final, really interesting concept the paper discusses.
The outer brain versus the inner brain.
Right. A way to conceptualize this divide. The outer brain encompasses those fast, high-dimensional, massively parallel systems close to the sensors and muscles. Vision, hearing, touch, motor control circuits.
Gigabit processors.
Pretty much. And the inner brain is the system responsible for the slower, perhaps lower dimensional, more serial processing involved in cognition, decision-making, planning, subjective experience.
The 10 bits desire.
Basically, yeah. And the challenge is understanding the interface between them. How does the inner brain handle the torrent of data from the outer brain, that drinking from the Hoover Dam analogy they used?
How does it handle it?
Well, we see massive data reduction happening at various stages. We talked about the retina. There are other areas like the superior colliculus in the brainstem that receive huge sensory convergence and seem involved in selecting targets for action, boiling down complex scenes into simpler commands.
So intense filtering and selection are key, but does the inner brain work fundamentally differently from the outer brain at the level of neurons?
That's a fascinating debate. Biologically, they're made of the same stuff, neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters. But the principles of operation might differ. In sensory neuroscience, outer brain, researchers often find neurons tuned to very specific features, and the focus is often on precise coding of high-dimensional information. In cognitive neuroscience, inner brain, studies often find neurons with more mixed or abstract responses, and analyses often focus on lower-dimensional patterns across populations, related to rules, categories, or decisions.
Is that a real difference, or just how we study them?
Good question. The paper suggests maybe the apparent low dimensionality in cognitive areas is partly an artifact of the highly simplified tasks we often use in experiments, like making the same choice over and over.
What happens in real life?
Real-life behavior is incredibly complex and dynamic. We're not just doing one thing. We're constantly switching between thousands of different microtasks, scanning the environment, planning the next step, monitoring our body, maybe thinking about lunch.
Right, juggling constantly.
Maybe the inner brain, with its vast number of neurons, isn't just for deep computation on one thing, but for flexibly routing and controlling these rapidly shifting information streams, managing this complex sequence of microtasks. That coordination itself could be the bottleneck.
So we need new ways to study the inner brain during more complex natural behaviors.
That seems to be the suggestion. Just as our understanding of the visual cortex exploded when scientists moved from simple light spots to complex natural images, maybe we need similar advances in studying the inner brain under more demanding, realistic conditions to reveal its true operational principles and understand this 10 bits limit.
There could be huge discoveries waiting there in understanding that inner-outer brain communication.
Absolutely. It feels like a major frontier.
Wow. Okay, this has been a lot to process at hopefully slightly more than 10 bits a second for our listeners.
Let's hope so.
So just to kind of wrap things up, we started with this puzzle, massive sensory input, billions of bits.
Versus this surprisingly slow behavioral output, this conscious processing rate, stuck around 10 bits per second.
And we've seen this rate pop up everywhere, from typing to games to memory feats.
And it's not easily explained away by photographic memory or just feeling like we see everything. There seems to be a real fundamental limit.
With huge implications for how we think about brain storage, evolution, other animals, and even designing things like brain-computer interfaces.
Definitely. It's a core unanswered question in neuroscience, touching on so many areas. Why this particular rate? What exactly imposes the limit? Is it the serial nature of cognition, our evolutionary history, the complexity of managing information flow? We don't fully know.
We don't, and it leaves us with a really interesting thought, doesn't it? Given this inherent slowness, this 10 bits leash, how should we maybe approach the world, especially now, with information flying at us faster than ever?
That's a great takeaway. Does it mean we need to be more selective?
Hmm.
To prioritize depth over speed? Or does it change how we think about the richness of experience itself? If it's not about the sheer volume of bits processed, what is it about?
Maybe it really is about the understanding we build with that limited bandwidth, the quality, not just the quantity. Something to definitely ponder.
For sure.
Well, this was fascinating. Thanks so much for walking us through this unbearable slowness. It's given me a ton to think about.
My pleasure. It's a topic that really makes you reconsider how your own mind works.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of you for tuning in for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.